In this video, we're going to tell you the untold story of every single Family Guy voice actor. Let's get started. Before we dive into the auditions, the accidents, and the contract mistakes that built one of the longest-running shows in television history, you need to understand something wild about Family Guy that most people never stop to think about. One guy is responsible for more of what you hear in Quahog than almost anyone realizes. Not two guys, not three. One man is voicing the dad, the baby, the dog, and the neighbor, and he's been doing it since 1999. That's not a gimmick. That's not a cost-cutting measure some Fox executive forced on the show. Seth MacFarlane chose to do this to himself on purpose, and the reason why is stranger and more personal than you'd expect. So today we're pulling back the curtain on every voice behind every character, starting with the man who started it all, and working our way through contract mistakes, phishing scams, a Batman legend's actual death, a writer's strike walkout, and a decision that would completely change who gets to voice a black cartoon character in modern television. This is the real story of the people who gave Quahog its voice. Let's start where the whole thing started, with a kid from Kent, Connecticut named Seth Woodbury MacFarlane, who was drawing cartoons before he could probably tie his own shoes. MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973, and from a young age he had this obsessive pull toward animation that a lot of kids have but very few actually turn into a career. He ended up at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of those schools people assume is just for painters and sculptors, but it's actually turned out some seriously important names in animation and design. And here's the detail that changes everything about how Family Guy came to exist. While he was at RISD, MacFarlane met a classmate named Mike Henry. You're going to hear that name over and over again in this video, because Mike Henry doesn't just become a Family Guy actor. He becomes one of the most important voices in the entire show for the next 2 decades, and his story eventually becomes one of the most talked about moments in the whole history of the series. But we'll get there. For now, just remember, this friendship formed in art school is the reason Family Guy's fictional town of Quahog is set in Rhode Island. MacFarlane basically built his entire universe out of his own college memories. For his senior thesis at RISD, MacFarlane created a short animated film called The Life of Larry. If you've never seen it, imagine an extremely rough, extremely early version of Peter Griffin, except his name is Larry, and he has a talking dog named Steve instead of Brian. The voice MacFarlane used for Larry already had that same cadence, that same doofy warmth that would eventually become Peter's signature sound. This wasn't some throwaway student project either. It got him hired directly out of college at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio responsible for stuff like the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo. At Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane cut his teeth working on shows like Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken, learning the actual mechanics of the industry from the inside. And then, in 1996, while he was still working there, he made a second short called Larry and Steve, which told the origin story of how the two title characters found each other. This one actually aired on Cartoon Network as part of their What a Cartoon showcase in 1997. Here's where things start moving fast. Mad TV executives noticed MacFarlane's work and helped connect him with Fox. Fox gave him $50,000 to develop what would eventually become Family Guy, redesigning Larry and Steve into Peter and Brian Griffin. Fox greenlit a 15-minute pilot in May of 1998, and by January 1999, Family Guy premiered as a full series, airing right after the Super Bowl, which at the time was basically the biggest platform television had to offer a brand new show. MacFarlane became the youngest showrunner in television history at the age of 24. Think about that for a second. 24 years old, running a network animated show, and also voicing the majority of the male cast himself. That's an insane amount of responsibility to hand one person, and it's exactly why what happens next matters so much. MacFarlane made a decision early on that shaped the entire creative DNA of the show. He chose to voice Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire all himself. He wasn't forced into this by budget constraints, and it wasn't some accident of casting. MacFarlane has explained that he believed it would genuinely be easier for him to perform the voices he had already envisioned in his own head than to try explaining them to another actor and hoping they landed exactly right. If you've ever tried to describe a very specific sound or feeling to somebody else, and watch them completely miss what you meant, you understand exactly why McFarlane made this call. He had these voices living in his imagination for years by that point, dating back to the life of Larry, and he wasn't willing to gamble that vision on someone else's interpretation. So let's actually break down where these voices came from, because the origin stories are stranger and more specific than you'd expect. Peter Griffin's voice is based on a security guard McFarlane overheard talking while he was a student at RISD. Somewhere out there's a security guard who has absolutely no idea that his voice became the basis for one of the most recognizable comedic characters of the last 25 years. McFarlane apparently just caught this guy's rhythm, his tone, that specific brand of clueless confidence, and it stuck with him so hard that he built an entire fictional dad around it. It's one of those details that sounds almost too simple to be true, but McFarlane has confirmed this exact origin multiple times in interviews. A random overheard conversation in a Rhode Island art school became the voice of Peter Griffin. Stewie's voice tells a completely different story, and it's honestly one of the more sophisticated character choices in the show's history. McFarlane based Stewie's voice on English actor Rex Harrison, specifically drawing from Harrison's performance in the 1964 musical drama My Fair Lady. If you've seen that film, you know Harrison plays Professor Henry Higgins, this incredibly proper, clipped, upper-crust British linguist who's obsessed with speech and manners. Now picture that exact vocal energy coming out of a homicidal baby who wants to conquer the world and also happens to be obsessed with matricide in early episodes. That contrast, an evil genius baby speaking with the polished, aristocratic cadence of a 1960s British stage actor, is exactly what makes Stewie work as a character. It shouldn't be funny on paper, but the collision between the sophisticated voice and the absurd context of a diaper-wearing toddler is basically the entire joke. Brian's voice might be the most surprising of all three, because McFarlane doesn't really do a voice for Brian at all. He uses what's essentially his own regular speaking voice for the family dog. This actually makes a lot of sense once you think about Brian's role on the show. Out of the entire Griffin household, Brian is supposed to be the closest thing to a normal, grounded, intellectual perspective. The one character who reads the newspaper, drinks martinis, and comments on politics like he's better than everyone else in the room, even though he's a dog. Giving him McFarlane's natural voice, without any exaggerated affectation, reinforces that sense that Brian sees himself as basically a person who just happens to walk on four legs. It's a subtle choice, but it's a smart one, because it separates Brian instantly from the more theatrical performances McFarlane gives Peter and Stewie. And then there's Glenn Quagmire, who might genuinely be the hardest character on the entire show for McFarlane to physically perform. Quagmire's voice was inspired by the sound of 1940s and 1950s radio commercials, that fast-talking, hyper-enthusiastic announcer style that used to sell you soap and cigarettes over the airwaves, decades before anyone on Family Guy was even born. McFarlane took that rapid-fire radio pitchman energy and turned it into one of the fastest-talking characters in the entire show. Quagmire probably speaks quicker than anyone else in Quahog, and that speed is intentional. It's baked directly into the character's DNA from the very first design. Quagmire has worn a lot of different hats across the show's run. He's been an airline pilot, Peter's drinking buddy, and the neighborhood's most persistent and problematic ladies' man, and depending on which context he's operating in, McFarlane shifts the performance slightly, but that underlying fast, aggressive, radio commercial energy never goes away. What's remarkable is just how flexible McFarlane is across these four voices in the middle of actual recording sessions. He's not recording Peter's lines one day and Stewie's lines the next in some kind of scheduled rotation. In a single scene, McFarlane might be reading Peter's dialogue, then immediately snapping into Brian's response, then delivering Stewie's next line, sometimes without even a beat of preparation in between. That kind of vocal control is a genuinely difficult skill, and it's part of why McFarlane has become one of the most decorated voice actors in Emmy history. He's tied the record for the most wins in the Outstanding Voiceover Performance category, sharing that distinction with Simpsons legends Dan Castellaneta and Hank Azaria. McFarlane's first win came all the way back in 2000, during the show's second season, for his performance as Stewie. He then went on to win again in 2016 for the episode Pilling Them Softly, in 2017 for The Boys in the Band, and again in 2019 for Con Eris. He's also picked up an Emmy for Outstanding Music and Lyrics back in 2002, working alongside composer Walter Murphy, which tells you McFarlane's musical background. The guy has released 9 studio albums in the style of classic American songbook singers, like Frank Sinatra, was baked into the show from an incredibly early stage. But McFarlane's voice acting responsibilities didn't stop at the 4 main characters. This is where things get almost overwhelming when you actually add it all up. McFarlane also provides voices for a huge number of recurring and one-off characters throughout the show's run. He voices news anchor Tom Tucker, delivering that stiff, overly serious local news cadence that makes even the most mundane Quahog headlines sound like breaking international crises. He voices Lois's father, Carter Pewterschmidt, the wealthy, disapproving, endlessly condescending patriarch of the Pewterschmidt family fortune, which creates this genuinely strange situation where McFarlane is voicing both Lois's husband and Lois's father in the same universe. 2 characters who couldn't be more different from each other if they tried. He voices Dr. Elmer Hartman, Quahog's morally questionable and frequently incompetent physician. He voices Jake and Tom Tucker, father and son news anchors. He's voiced God on multiple occasions, and Jesus Christ before writer Alex Sulkin took over that role following the show's revival. He's even voiced the Kool-Aid Man in certain cutaway gags, and Jasper, one of the more minor recurring characters in Quahog's sprawling ensemble. To put a number on it, McFarlane is credited with voicing something in the range of 700 distinct voices across Family Guy's more than 2 decades on air, when you account for every one-off character, every background gag, every random guy who shows up for a single line in a cutaway joke and then disappears forever. Some of these are barely disguised variations on his existing voices, sure, but plenty of them are genuinely distinct performances that most casual viewers wouldn't even realize came from the same guy who voices Peter Griffin. There's also a Simpsons fanon detail worth mentioning here that's almost too good not to include. In The Simpsons game, when Matt Groening introduces himself to Homer and Bart, he refers to himself as TV's most beloved animation visionary, and Homer immediately responds by asking, "Seth MacFarlane." It's a joke that only works because by that point in television history, McFarlane's name recognition had genuinely reached graining levels among a certain generation of viewers, and the 2 shows have always had this strange rivalry/mutual respect dynamic running underneath the surface. Family Guy actually returned the favor years later in an episode called The Simpsons Guy, which features Seth MacFarlane appearing as himself in a courtroom scene seated across from Groening. There's one more piece of McFarlane's personal history that connects directly to the show and honestly puts his entire career in a different light once you know it. McFarlane was scheduled to be on American Airlines Flight 11, the plane that was hijacked on September 11, 2001, and flown into the World Trade Center in New York City. He missed that flight by 10 minutes due to a combination of being hungover from the night before and a miscommunication with his travel agency about the departure time. Sit with that for a second. The guy who would go on to spend the next 2 decades voicing Peter Griffin, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire, who would win 5 Emmy Awards, create American Dad, write and direct Ted, host the Academy Awards, and build an entire multimedia empire, missed being on one of the most catastrophic flights in American history by the length of time it takes to microwave a burrito. It's the kind of detail that sounds like something out of a movie script, except it's completely real and verified. And it's the reason Family Guy exists in its current form at all. If that 10 minutes had gone differently, an entire chunk of animated television history simply doesn't happen. McFarlane's personal beliefs and advocacy also bleed directly into the writing of Brian Griffin specifically, which makes sense once you realize how much of himself McFarlane pours into that character. He's been an outspoken supporter of gay rights, atheism, and marijuana legalization for years, speaking at universities across the country on these topics. And when you look at certain Family Guy episodes, particularly ones like You May Now Kiss the Guy Who Receives, or Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, or 420, you can see these exact positions being voiced almost directly through Brian, without much disguise or subtlety. Brian becomes McFarlane's mouthpiece in a lot of these episodes, which adds an interesting layer once you understand that McFarlane isn't just performing a voice, he's often performing something closer to his own actual worldview through a character who happens to be an anthropomorphic dog with a drinking problem and a failed novelist's ego. Family Guy's road to success wasn't instant either, and this is important context for understanding just how much pressure was riding on MacFarlane personally in those early years. The show was actually canceled twice before it became the cultural institution people recognize today. Fox first canceled Family Guy after its second season due to low ratings, but the series was given a last-minute reprieve, earning a third season. Then in 2002, Fox canceled it again, and this time it looked permanent. One unaired episode from that third season wouldn't actually premiere until over a year later, when it finally aired on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block in 2003. Fox tried to sell the rerun rights to other networks and reportedly had a hard time finding any takers. Cartoon Network eventually picked up the rights basically for free, according to the president of 20th Century Fox Television at the time, which tells you just how little anyone believed in this show's commercial future in 2002. Nobody, including the people running the network that made it, thought Family Guy had a real future. We'll come back to exactly how that changed, because the DVD sales and Adult Swim numbers that eventually saved this show are honestly one of the wildest redemption stories in modern television. But for now, just sit with the fact that the guy who would go on to become one of the most Emmy-decorated voice actors in television history was, for a solid 3 years in the early 2000s, the creator of a canceled cartoon that nobody wanted to touch. That's the man behind the curtain, the one voice responsible for the majority of Quahog's male population. But Family Guy was never a one-man show, even if MacFarlane's fingerprints are all over nearly every episode ever produced. Next, we're going to talk about the woman who almost didn't get the job at all, whose audition for Lois Griffin happened completely blind, without ever having met MacFarlane or seen a single piece of his artwork, and whose entire vocal performance was reshaped by one incredibly blunt note from the show's creator that's become one of the most quoted pieces of Family Guy trivia in the show's history. Let's talk about the woman who became the voice of Lois Griffin, because her path onto this show is one of the stranger origin stories in the entire cast, and it starts years before Family Guy even existed as an idea on paper. Alex Borstein was born Alexandria Borstein on February 15, 1971, in Highland Park, Illinois, to a Jewish family with a genuinely heavy history behind it. Her mother and her maternal grandmother were both Holocaust survivors, born and raised in Budapest, Hungary, and they immigrated to the United States after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Her father was raised Orthodox in Atlanta, and Borstein has spoken openly about the weight of carrying that family history forward, saying in interviews that having a mother and grandmother who survived the Holocaust gives her a large sense of responsibility to continue that culture and those traditions, even if she doesn't consider herself especially religious day to day. The family eventually moved from Deerfield, Illinois to Northridge, California, and Borstein graduated from Chatsworth High School in 1989 before heading off to San Francisco State University, where she studied rhetoric. Before she ever set foot near a Family Guy recording booth, Borstein trained in improvisational comedy at the Acme Comedy Theater near Hollywood. This is where her entire career trajectory really starts to take shape, and it's also where she met her future writing partner and husband, Jackson Douglas. While working at an ad agency writing print ads for Barbie, of all things, Borstein left that job to become a full-time writer, picking up work on animated shows like The Spooktacular New Adventures of Casper and Pinky and the Brain. In 1996, while still writing for Casper, she even provided the voice of Queen Machina, the villain of the Machine Empire, on Power Rangers Zeo. So by the time Family Guy comes calling, Borstein already had years of behind-the-scenes writing and voice work under her belt, which is easy to forget once you only know her as Lois Griffin. The moment that actually changes everything happens in 1997, when a casting agent spots Borstein performing with the Acme troupe at the Big Stinkin' International Improv and Sketch Comedy Festival in Austin, Texas. That performance gets her cast on the third season of Mad TV, the Fox sketch comedy show that ran opposite Saturday Night Live for well over a decade. On Mad TV, Borstein became genuinely famous for a character called Ms. Swan, the owner of the gorgeous Pretty Beauty nail salon, along with a rotating cast of other recurring characters including Aerosist Ann, a lounge singer named Shonda, and a mean television reporter named Sue Napersville. Borstein has since been candid and a little uncomfortable in retrospect about Ms. Swan specifically, explaining in a 2025 interview that the character started as a loving impression of her own grandmother, performed live with a curly gray wig, before Mad TV's producers changed the visual design, giving her chopped black hair and setting the sketch inside a nail salon, which shifted the character into what Borstein now describes as an unfortunate racist caricature that has aged very poorly. It's a rare moment of a performer looking back at her own breakout material with real self-awareness, and it says something about how differently comedy standards have shifted over the past 25 years. While Borstein was working on Mad TV, the same production company developing that show was also quietly working on a very different project with a young animator named Seth MacFarlane. According to Borstein, MacFarlane was originally supposed to create short animated segments to air between MAD TV sketches, similar to how The Simpsons famously began as shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show decades earlier. But MacFarlane, in Borstein's own words, was too savvy for that arrangement and wanted his own standalone series instead. That's how the two of them were introduced. MacFarlane asked Borstein if she would help voice a small pilot demonstration reel, and by her own account, she read the material and found it very different and very funny. Here's the detail that makes this whole story feel almost accidental in retrospect. Borstein has said flatly that her audition happened, quote, really sight unseen. She had not met Seth MacFarlane in person, and she had not seen a single piece of his artwork before agreeing to voice this pilot. She was essentially recording lines for a stranger's unproven concept with zero visual reference for who these characters even looked like, based entirely on the strength of the writing itself. At the time she recorded that pilot, Borstein was performing in a stage show in Los Angeles, where she played a red-headed stage mother, and the voice she used for that character was based on one of her actual cousins. That voice, warm but a little sharp around the edges, became the rough foundation for what would eventually turn into Lois Griffin. But the version MacFarlane originally heard was not the Lois Griffin we know today. It was slower, and in that original season, noticeably deeper than the voice audiences would come to recognize. And this is where one of the most quoted, most blunt pieces of behind-the-scenes Family Guy trivia comes directly from MacFarlane's own mouth. When he heard Borstein's original take on the character, his direction to her was, and this is a direct quote that's been repeated in interviews for over 2 decades now, make it a little less fucking annoying and speed it up, or every episode will last 4 hours. That single note, delivered with almost no diplomatic softening whatsoever, is the reason Lois Griffin sounds the way she does today. A slower, deeper, more grating original performance got compressed and sharpened into the quicker, brighter voice that's carried the character through more than 20 seasons. Once Family Guy actually premiered in January 1999, Borstein found herself voicing more than just Lois. She also provides the voice of Trisha Takanawa, the show's recurring Asian correspondent character on Quahog's local news broadcasts, Loretta Brown, who is Cleveland's ex-wife, and Barbara Pewterschmidt, Lois's mother, which means Borstein, much like MacFarlane, ended up voicing multiple generations within the same fictional family tree. She's also made brief cameo appearances reprising Miss Swan within the world of Family Guy itself, including in a 2005 episode, blending her Mad TV legacy directly into her Family Guy work. Family Guy's cancellations in 2000 and 2002 hit Borstein's career at an interesting crossroads too. Around the same period the show was struggling to survive on Fox's schedule, Borstein was actually cast as Sookie St. James in the pilot for a brand new WB drama called Gilmore Girls. She filmed the pilot and by all accounts was set to continue in the role, but her contract with Mad TV wouldn't allow her to split her time between the two shows once Mad TV got renewed for another season. That's an enormous fork in the road when you think about it. Borstein was on the verge of becoming a series regular on what would go on to become one of the most beloved dramas of the early 2000s, and instead her contractual obligations to a sketch comedy show pulled her away from the role entirely. The part of Sookie St. James went instead to a then relatively unknown comedic actress named Melissa McCarthy, who used that role as a springboard into a massive career of her own. Borstein has actually joked about this exact turn of events, acknowledging that she's sort of inadvertently responsible for jump-starting Melissa McCarthy's entire career, simply by being unavailable at the right moment. Borstein left Mad TV during its 2001 to 2002 season, right around the time Family Guy was facing its second and more serious cancellation. But rather than her career stalling out, Borstein kept building a substantial body of work behind the scenes on Family Guy itself, transitioning into roles as a staff writer and producer on top of her voice acting duties. She co-wrote and co-hosted Family Guy Presents Seth and Alex's almost live comedy show alongside MacFarlane, and she co-wrote a companion book called It Takes a Village Idiot and I Married One with fellow writer Cherry Chevapravat-Dumrong. She also spent time as a writer and supervising producer on the Showtime drama Shameless, even appearing in a small on-screen role during its first season, proving that her ambitions extended well beyond simply providing a voice for one character. In 2013, Borstein was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Voiceover Performance, recognized for the episode Lois Comes Out of Her Shell. She wouldn't actually win in that specific category until 2018, when she took home the trophy for the episode Nanny Goats, in which she voices Lois, Barbara Pewterschmidt, and a character named Natalia, all within the same episode submission, showcasing exactly the kind of vocal range and character juggling that made her such a valuable piece of the show's ensemble from the very beginning. But the moment that truly redefined Alex Borstein's public identity, arguably even more than 2 decades of voicing Lois Griffin ever did, came from a completely different show entirely. In 2017, Borstein landed the role of Susie Meyerson, the chain-smoking, foul-mouthed manager and confidant to Rachel Brosnahan's title character on Amazon's The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. According to Borstein, series creator Amy Sherman Palladino kept telling her throughout the process that she was going to get her an Emmy for the role, a promise Borstein admits she didn't fully believe at the time, saying she'd more or less given up on the idea that show business still had major surprises left for her. Sherman Palladino turned out to be exactly right. Borstein won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series in 2018, and she won it again the following year, giving her 2 consecutive Emmy victories for a live-action, on-camera performance, a genuinely remarkable pivot for someone whose most famous role for nearly 2 decades had been an entirely voice-based character that most casual fans probably couldn't have picked out of a lineup. Reflecting on Family Guy's evolution decades into its run, Borstein has acknowledged that the show itself has changed with the times, saying in a 2025 interview that there's a bit more care now in how the show chooses its targets, and, in her words, the direction we punch has shifted somewhat since the earliest seasons. She's pointed out that when the show premiered in 1999, MacFarlane was a complete outsider to the entertainment industry, with nothing to lose and no relationships to protect. Now that MacFarlane has become genuinely close with people who could plausibly be targets of the show's humor, Borstein says that friendship has certainly complicated the calculus behind certain jokes in a way that simply didn't exist in Family Guy's earliest, scrappiest years. It's a rare bit of honest reflection from someone who has been embedded in this show's writer's room and cast for over 2.5 decades, watching both the show and the entire cultural landscape around it shift dramatically underneath her. Now let's turn to the man behind Chris Griffin, whose audition for the role apparently hinged on doing an impression of a serial killer from a completely different genre of film, and whose personal life decades later would collide head-on with the strange, unregulated world of cryptocurrency in a way that genuinely threatened to derail an entirely separate television project he'd spent years developing. Chris Griffin's voice belongs to Seth Green, and his path onto Family Guy is a little different from Borstein's or MacFarlane's, mostly because Green was already a working actor with a real resume by the time he showed up to audition. Green was cast as the family's awkward, dim-witted teenage son during the show's original pilot casting process back in 1998 and 1999, and by that point he already had genuine name recognition. He'd built a career playing memorable supporting roles across a range of projects, most notably as Scott Evil in the Austin Powers films opposite Mike Myers, and as Oz, the guitar-playing werewolf on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, one of the most beloved supporting characters in that entire show's run. So unlike Borstein's blind audition or MacFarlane's years of quietly building toward his own creation, Green arrived at Family Guy as a recognizable young actor who had already proven himself in front of a camera, now trying his hand at something purely vocal. The audition story itself is one of those details that sounds almost too strange to be true, except Green has confirmed it himself. He stated that during his audition for the role of Chris, he did an impression of the character Buffalo Bill from the psychological thriller The Silence of the Lambs. If you know that film, you know exactly what that means. Buffalo Bill is one of the most unsettling villains in movie history, a serial killer with a bizarre, breathy, unnervingly soft-spoken cadence. Somehow, whatever Green did with that impression in the audition room translated into the voice of a good-natured, slow-witted teenage boy who spends most of his screen time drawing badly, getting bullied, and stumbling through the most mundane teenage problems imaginable. It's genuinely one of the strangest pipeline-to-character stories in the entire Family Guy cast. A serial killer impression somehow becoming the foundation for Quahog's most harmless and easily confused resident. Beyond Chris, Green also became the primary voice for Neil Goldman, the awkward, obsessive, frequently unsettling classmate who's been hopelessly infatuated with Meg Griffin for most of the show's run. Green's range as a performer clearly extended past just doing one register for one character, and it made him a valuable part of the vocal ensemble in ways that went beyond his top-billed role as Chris. Outside of Family Guy, Green kept building an increasingly varied career. He appeared in Mars Needs Moms, lent his voice to characters in the sketch comedy series Mad, and voiced Leonardo in a run of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles projects. He also starred in Seth MacFarlane's short-lived sitcom Dads, extending the working relationship between the two Seths, beyond just the animated world. But arguably Green's most significant achievement outside of Family Guy is Robot Chicken, the stop-motion sketch comedy series he co-created and executive produced, alongside Matthew Senreich. Robot Chicken went on to win multiple Emmy Awards of its own, establishing Green as someone with legitimate creative and producing chops well beyond just being a hired voice for somebody else's show. By any measure, Green built one of the more diverse careers among the Family Guy main cast, splitting time between live-action acting, voice work, and running his own production company. Which brings us to the strangest, most unexpected chapter in Seth Green's entire career, one that has nothing to do with Family Guy directly, but says a lot about how quickly a well-established Hollywood career can collide head-on with the chaos of internet culture. In 2021, Green became one of a wave of celebrities who purchased Bored Ape Yacht Club NFTs, these digital collectible images of cartoon apes that, for a strange window of time during the pandemic, became simultaneously a status symbol, an investment vehicle, and a genuine cultural phenomenon. Green bought his Bored Ape, officially numbered 8398, out of a total collection of 10,000 unique images, sometime around July 2021. He gave the character a name, Fred Simeon, and he didn't just want to own it as a static picture. Green spent months developing an entire animated show around this character, called White Horse Tavern, envisioning a world where popular NFT characters lived and worked alongside real humans, with Fred Simeon working as a bartender at a version of the actual historic White Horse Tavern in New York City. In May of 2022, just days before Fred was supposed to make his public debut in a trailer at the NFT conference VCon, Green fell victim to a phishing scam. He clicked through what he thought was a legitimate website connected to a separate NFT collection called Gutter Cat Gang, but it was actually a cloned scam site designed to trick users into authorizing a transaction that would drain their digital wallets. Green's wallet was connected to the fake site, and within minutes, a scammer transferred away 4 of his most valuable NFTs, including the Bored Ape that was supposed to be the star of his new show, along with 2 mutant apes and a doodle NFT. On Twitter, Green posted about it publicly, writing, quote, "Well, friends, it happened to me. Got phished and had 4 NFTs stolen," and specifically calling out the account that had ended up in possession of his stolen Bored Ape, writing, quote, "Looks like you bought my stolen ape. Hit me up so we can fix it." Here's where the story gets genuinely strange from a legal standpoint, and it's a detail that most casual observers of the story completely missed at the time. Bored Ape Yacht Club, as a project, was structured so that whoever technically owns a specific Bored Ape NFT also owns the commercial usage rights tied to that specific image. That meant when Green's Bored Ape got stolen and resold to a new anonymous buyer for roughly $200,000 worth of cryptocurrency, that new buyer, at least on paper, now held the commercial rights to develop and profit from Fred Simeon's likeness. Green, who had already spent months building an entire television show around this exact character, was suddenly facing the very real possibility that he no longer had the legal right to use his own show's protagonist. At a public panel discussion at VCon, Green described the situation in blunt terms, saying, quote, "I bought that ape in July 2021 and have spent the last several months developing and exploiting the IP to make it into the star of this show. Then days before, his name is Fred, by the way, days before he's set to make his world debut, he's literally kidnapped. He even told the crowd, 'Guys, if there's a door to kick in, I promise I'm going to kick in the door for us,' framing his effort to recover the character almost like a hostage negotiation. Blockchain investigators eventually traced the theft, revealing that the scammer had netted over $400,000 in cryptocurrency from Green's stolen assets combined, using a laundering technique called a peel chain to move the funds through multiple transactions in an effort to obscure their origin. The Bored Ape itself ended up in the hands of a collector operating under the pseudonym Darkwing84, who, according to later reporting from BuzzFeed News, was actually an Australian surgeon who collected NFTs on the side under yet another pseudonym, Mr. Cheese. This collector maintained that he had purchased the Bored Ape in good faith, stating he had no way of knowing it was stolen property at the time of the purchase, since it hadn't been flagged as suspicious when he bought it. After roughly 3 weeks of public back and forth, direct appeals from Green, and reported threats of legal action over the disputed usage rights, Green ultimately paid approximately $300,000 to recover his stolen Bored Ape and restore his ability to develop the show. It's a genuinely remarkable sequence of events. An actor best known for voicing a cartoon teenager on Family Guy ended up having to essentially ransom back a piece of digital art in order to protect a completely separate creative project, in a situation with almost no established legal precedent, since courts at the time had barely begun to grapple with what ownership and copyright even meant in the context of stolen NFTs. Now let's shift over to a character whose voice has changed hands more times than almost anyone else on this show, and whose current voice actor was only 15 years old when she got the job, thanks to a contract dispute that nobody planned for and that almost nobody in the audience at the time would have even noticed. Meg Griffin's voice history is genuinely one of the more layered stories in the entire Family Guy cast, because there have actually been multiple different women behind that character, starting even before the show officially aired. Before the show was picked up as a full series, voice actress Cree Summer, who is probably best known as the voice of Elmira in Tiny Toon Adventures, was originally hired to voice Meg for Family Guy's original pilot presentation. But Summer was let go by producers before she ever actually got to record a single line, which means the very first Meg Griffin voice most people think of as canon isn't even the first one that was ever attached to the project. Once the show was officially greenlit and moved into its first season, the role of Meg went to Lacey Chabert, an actress who at the time was already known for playing Claudia Salinger on the Fox drama Party of Five, and who would go on years later to become one of the most recognizable faces in Hallmark's Christmas movie universe, along with a memorable turn as Gretchen Wieners in 2004's Mean Girls. Chabert voiced Meg throughout Family Guy's entire first season and into a handful of early Season 2 episodes, though her work went completely uncredited on screen at the time. If you've ever come across an early Family Guy episode in syndication and thought Meg sounded strangely different, that's not a glitch in your memory. That's genuinely Chabert's voice, distinct from the Meg most modern viewers grew up hearing. Chabert left the show after that first production season, and the reasons behind her departure have actually been explained slightly differently over the years by different people involved. Chabert herself told GameSpy in 2006 that she left of her own accord, explaining that she was in school at the time and also working on Party of Five simultaneously, and the scheduling simply became too much to juggle alongside a growing animated series. Seth MacFarlane, meanwhile, described her exit in 2003 to IGN as, quote, purely a contractual thing, explaining, I think there was a mistake in her contract, and I guess she had not intended to be involved for, like, the full run of the show. Whether it was primarily a scheduling conflict, a contractual oversight, or some combination of both, everyone involved has consistently described the parting as amicable, with no reported tension between Chabert and MacFarlane at any point. That departure opened the door for a 15-year-old actress named Mila Kunis, who at the time was already working on another Fox sitcom that would go on to define a huge chunk of her early career. Kunis was born Milena Markovna Kunis on August 14, 1983, in Chernivtsi, a city that was then part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic within the Soviet Union. Her family immigrated to Los Angeles when she was 7 years old in 1991, in part because of anti-Semitism they experienced in the Soviet Union, and Kunis has spoken candidly about how difficult that transition was as a young child, saying she blocked out most of her memories from that first year because she cried constantly, unable to understand the language or the culture around her. Before Family Guy ever entered the picture, Kunis had already landed one of the more unusual casting stories in 90s television. In 1998, she auditioned for the role of Jackie Burkhart on the Fox sitcom That 70s Show. The show's producers required that all actors auditioning for the teenage roles be at least 18 years old. Kunis, who was only 14 at the time, told casting directors she would be 18 without specifying exactly when that birthday was going to happen. Producers eventually figured out the truth, but by that point they had already decided she was simply the best fit for the character regardless of her actual age. Kunis herself has confirmed this story publicly on multiple occasions, telling Vanity Fair directly, quote, "I'd like to make it very clear now that I did lie. I did." She's explained that by the time she reached the final network casting call, contracts required a studio teacher designation for any actor still enrolled in school, and that's when producers realized she was actually 14, not 18 as she'd initially implied. According to Kunis, once the show's creators had already fallen in love with her performance, her real age simply stopped mattering to them. That 70s show ended up running for 8 seasons, ultimately introducing Kunis to her future husband, fellow cast member Ashton Kutcher, though the two of them didn't actually get together romantically until years after the show ended, despite playing on-again, off-again love interests within the show's fictional storyline. But while Kunis was still working on That 70s Show in 1999, she also auditioned for the newly vacant role of Meg Griffin on Family Guy. According to MacFarlane, her audition immediately convinced him she was the right fit, and he specifically recalled a line reading where Meg calls Peter an idiot, saying that delivery, quote, just nailed the tone he'd been searching for in the character. Kunis has said that during her audition process, MacFarlane instructed her to slow down her line delivery, which suggests the production team was actively shaping and refining the character's voice in real time, rather than simply plugging in whichever actress happened to sound closest to what Chabert had already established. Since taking over the role, starting with the episode Da Boom in Season 2, Kunis has voiced Meg Griffin continuously for over 25 years, making her one of the longest-tenured performers in the entire Family Guy cast, despite having joined slightly later than the rest of the original ensemble. Unlike MacFarlane, Borstein, and Green, who've all voiced dozens of side characters across the show's run, Kunis has remained almost entirely devoted to Meg and Meg-adjacent characters, rarely branching out into other roles within the Family Guy universe. There's an interesting wrinkle here worth mentioning too. In the Season 4 episode Don't Make Me Over, which required a temporarily glamorous, more confident version of Meg to actually sing, Kunis stepped aside so that voice acting veteran Tara Strong, known for her extensive work on shows like The Powerpuff Girls and My Little Pony, could handle the singing portions of that particular episode instead. Chabert's original run as Meg hasn't been erased from the show's internal continuity either. It's actually become something of a recurring inside joke. In the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Stewie and Brian travel back in time to the show's original pilot, complete with the vintage animation style and archival audio of Chabert's original performance as Meg. Stewie, upon hearing her, reacts with visible confusion, at one point remarking on how different she sounds. In 2018's The Griffin Winter Games, Chabert actually returned to voice a fictionalized version of herself, competing directly against Mila Kunis's Meg in a downhill skiing race, a genuinely clever bit of meta-humor that acknowledges the character's real-world voice history directly within the show's own fictional universe. And there's a running gag throughout the series where Peter occasionally invokes the name Lacey Chabert as a kind of threat, jokingly warning Lois that she could be replaced the same way an actress once was, tying the show's off-screen production history directly into its on-screen jokes in a way that most other animated sitcoms would never even attempt. Kunis's financial arrangement on the show also tells its own quiet story about how much Family Guy's fortunes changed over the decades. When she first joined in 2000, her per-episode salary was reportedly around $15,000, a fairly modest sum for a show that, at that exact moment in its history, was actively getting canceled by its own network. That number climbed dramatically over the years, and in November 2013, The Hollywood Reporter revealed that Kunis, along with Alex Borstein, Seth Green, and Mike Henry, had secured major new contracts that would pay each of them somewhere between $175,000 and $225,000 per episode, locking in that rate for at least 2 additional seasons, with options extending as far as 5 seasons total. Seth MacFarlane's own compensation was negotiated entirely separately from this deal, since his contract with 20th Television included a number of additional components tied to his role as the show's creator and primary star. It's worth remembering that Kunis has gone on to build an enormous film career in the years since, with her personal net worth now estimated well beyond her Family Guy earnings alone. But the Meg Griffin role, the one she got at 15 years old, as a direct result of another actress's contract dispute, has remained a constant thread running through her entire adult career. Now we're going to move into one of the most significant and genuinely consequential stories in this entire video. The story of the man who spent 20 years voicing one of Family Guy's most beloved characters, and the decision he made in 2020 that would ripple across the entire landscape of American television animation. Mike Henry's story is inseparable from Family Guy's own origin, because remember, he's the same guy Seth MacFarlane met as a classmate at the Rhode Island School of Design, the friendship that directly inspired Quahog being set in Rhode Island in the first place. Henry wasn't just a college buddy MacFarlane brought along for old time's sake either. He became a genuine creative force behind the scenes, working as a writer and producer on the show in addition to his voice acting duties, which is part of why his character assignments ended up being so varied and so central to the show's comedic engine. Henry began his run on Family Guy as part of the recurring cast repertory rather than the main cast, voicing a whole collection of side characters in the show's early years before eventually earning a promotion to main cast status in 2005. His signature role, and the one most casually associated with his name, is Cleveland Brown, the Griffin's laid-back, slow-talking, endlessly patient next-door neighbor who's been part of the show since its very first episode in 1999. But Cleveland was never remotely the only character Henry brought to life. He also voiced John the Pervert, Herbert, the unsettling elderly neighbor whose entire character is built around uncomfortable jokes about his attraction to Chris. He voiced Bruce, a flamboyantly gay performance artist who shows up recurringly throughout the show's run, and he voiced Consuela, a Latina maid character whose broken English catchphrase, "No, no, no, no," became one of the show's more recognizable recurring bits. Cleveland eventually became significant enough within the Family Guy universe that he got his own spin-off series entirely, The Cleveland Show, which ran on Fox for 4 seasons, from 2009 to 2013, following Cleveland and his newly reconstituted family after he leaves Quahog for his hometown of Stoolbend, Virginia. Reception to the spin-off was mixed at best throughout its run, and it was eventually canceled due to declining viewership, with Cleveland then returning to his original supporting role back on Family Guy itself. Following the end of The Cleveland Show, Henry continued voicing Cleveland's stepson, Rollo Tubbs, back within the main Family Guy series, carrying that character forward even after the spin-off had ended. Now let's get into the moment that changed everything, both for Henry personally and for the broader landscape of animated television as an industry. On June 26, 2020, after 20 years of voicing Cleveland Brown, Mike Henry announced on Twitter that he was stepping down from the role. His statement was direct and specific about his reasoning. He wrote, quote, "It's been an honor to play Cleveland on Family Guy for 20 years. I love this character, but persons of color should play characters of color. Therefore, I will be stepping down from the role." End quote. This wasn't an isolated decision happening in a vacuum either. Henry's announcement came in the immediate aftermath of a broader industry reckoning that had already claimed several other high-profile voice roles that same summer. Voice actress Jenny Slate had recently withdrawn from playing the mixed-race character Missy on Netflix's Big Mouth, explaining publicly that she had originally reasoned it was permissible for her to voice the character because Missy's mother was Jewish and white, just like Slate herself, but she'd come to recognize that reasoning as flawed, describing her original justification as an example of white privilege and unjust allowances made within a system of societal white supremacy. Around the same time, actress Kristen Bell withdrew from voicing a biracial character named Molly on Apple TV Plus's Central Park. Fox itself, the same network airing Family Guy, had also just announced that The Simpsons would no longer have white actors voicing non-white characters going forward, a policy shift that was making headlines the exact same week Henry made his own announcement. It's important to be precise here about exactly what Henry's decision covered because there's been some confusion and misinformation circulating about this online in the years since, including some claims on fan wikis suggesting Henry stepped away from all of his non-white and LGBT characters simultaneously. According to Deadline's direct reporting at the time, which remains the most reliable account of what actually happened, Henry specifically stepped down only from voicing Cleveland Brown. He continued to remain a series regular on Family Guy, and he continued voicing Bruce the performance artist and Herbert the elderly neighbor, along with a range of other ancillary characters he'd built over 2 decades on the show. His decision was specifically and narrowly about the ethics of a white actor continuing to voice the show's primary black character, not a wholesale retirement from every character he'd ever played. Fan reaction to Henry's announcement was genuinely divided in real time, and you can still find that split preserved in the comment sections of articles covering the story from that period. Some fans praised the decision as an overdue and meaningful step. Others pushed back forcefully, with some commenters explicitly stating they had no problem with a white actor voicing a black character and wanted Henry to remain in the role regardless. That tension, between viewers who saw this as a necessary correction and viewers who saw it as an unnecessary concession to changing cultural standards, played out publicly and loudly across social media for weeks following the announcement. Roughly 3 months after Henry's initial statement, on September 25, 2020, Family Guy announced his replacement. The role would go to Arif Zahir, a 26-year-old YouTube personality who had spent more than 7 years building an online following through impressions and voice content on his channel Azairs. And the story of how Zahir actually landed this role is one of the more organic, grassroots casting stories in recent television history. Arif Zahir Lopes Thrower was born on April 15, 1994, in Berkeley, California, of African-American and Cape Verdean descent. He spent part of his childhood in New Bedford, Massachusetts, attending Nativity Preparatory School and Keith Middle School before moving back to California in 2007. Zahir began doing voice impressions in middle school specifically to entertain his classmates, and he created his first YouTube channel, focused primarily on magic tricks, before eventually pivoting toward voice impressions and gaming content. One of the very first impressions he ever did, long before it became relevant to his actual career, was of Cleveland Brown. Through videos combining popular video games with his character impressions, including a viral hit called Ted Plays Call of Duty that racked up over 20 million views, Zahir built his channel into a genuine internet presence with millions of subscribers, all while doing impressions of characters including Cleveland, former President Obama, and Marvel's Black Panther. The moment Henry's departure was announced in June 2020, Zahir didn't wait around hoping someone would notice him. He immediately posted a TikTok video putting himself forward directly for the role, opening with the line, quote, "So apparently the voice actor for Cleveland Brown stepped down today," before breaking straight into the character's signature honking laugh. He followed that up on Twitter with a more direct pitch, writing, "IV volunteer as tribute," tagging both Henry and the official Family Guy account. He also uploaded a video to his main channel titled, "Cleveland Brown Plays Modern Warfare," in honor of Mike Henry, and started an online petition specifically aimed at getting Fox executives to consider him for the role. The petition ultimately gathered 19,797 signatures, just shy of its stated goal of 20,000, but it clearly generated enough attention and momentum to get noticed by the people who actually mattered. When the casting was officially confirmed in September 2020, Zahir released a statement that captured both his genuine excitement and the surreal nature of what had just happened to him. He said, quote, "Firstly, I'm eternally grateful to have received this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. When I heard that Mike Henry was stepping down from the role of Cleveland Brown, my favorite cartoon character of all time, I was shocked and saddened, assuming we'd never see him again. When I learned I would get to take over the role, overabundant gratitude. To Mike, you created something truly special, and I promise I will do my absolute best to honor your legacy. Henry, for his part, offered a public show of support for his successor, stating, "I welcome Arif to the Family Guy team." Arif's vocal talent is obvious, but his understanding of Cleveland and his respect for the character give me confidence that he is in the right hands. I look forward to getting to know Arif and working with him to make sure Cleveland stays every bit as awesome as he has always been. This wasn't a case of an outgoing performer bitterly handing off a role under pressure. By every available account, both men approached the transition with genuine mutual respect, which is a rarer outcome in these kinds of high-profile recastings than you might expect. Zahir began voicing Cleveland Brown starting with Family Guy's 20th season, since the 19th season's episodes were already fully completed or deep into production when Henry's decision was originally announced, meaning Henry's voice continued appearing on new episodes for months after his own departure announcement had already gone public. Cleveland is far from the only character of color who was recast with a performer of color during this specific window of television history. The article coverage from that period explicitly frames Family Guy's decision as part of a broader movement across the industry to end what's been called voiceover whitewashing in animated television, with multiple shows across multiple networks making similar changes within the same handful of months. Zahir's career trajectory since landing the role has continued to climb. He signed with the Creative Artists Agency shortly after his casting was announced, and he became a recurring cast member on the fan series How It Should Have Ended, even before his Family Guy casting, where he'd already been voicing Black Panther. By any measure, this is a genuine internet-to-mainstream success story. An impressionist who built an entire audience from scratch on YouTube, doing an impression of a character for years, purely out of love for the source material, who then turned that specific skill directly into a professional, ongoing role on the exact show he'd been impersonating. There's one more character transition tied directly into this same period of Family Guy's history worth mentioning here, and it's one that gets far less attention than the Cleveland Brown recasting, even though it happened around the exact same time and for related reasons. In 2020, it was announced that veteran actor Sam Elliott would take over as Quahog's new mayor, following the death of the character who had held that office since the show's earliest years. Rather than simply casting a new actor to replace the same character, the show introduced an entirely new mayor named Wild West, described as the late Mayor Adam West's estranged cousin, with Elliott bringing his own distinctive, gravelly cowboy voice to the role rather than attempting to replicate anything close to his predecessor's performance. Which brings us directly to the story of the man Wild West was created to replace, and one of the most unusual, genuinely moving tributes this show has ever produced for one of its own actors. Adam West's connection to Family Guy actually predates the show's revival by several years, since West began voicing an exaggerated, self-parodying version of himself as the mayor of Quahog starting back in 2000, appearing in more than 100 episodes across nearly 2 decades of the show's run. This casting made a strange kind of sense given West's own career history. Long before Family Guy existed, West had already achieved cultural immortality playing Batman in the campy 1960s live-action television series, a role so tonally specific and so thoroughly embedded in pop culture memory that West spent much of the following decades finding ways to lean into and reinterpret that legacy rather than escape it. Voicing an unhinged, incompetent, wildly self-absorbed version of himself as Quahog's mayor let West essentially satirize his own public image, turning decades of Batman-era typecasting into an ongoing joke he was fully in on. Adam West died on June 9, 2017, at the age of 88, following a battle with leukemia. Family Guy's response to his death unfolded across an unusually extended timeline, and the way the show chose to handle it says a lot about how seriously the creative team took West's contribution to the series. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, Family Guy aired an episode featuring a simple photo memorializing the show's mayor, followed by an in-loving memory card preceding a rerun of an episode called The Dating Game, which happened to be one of West's final recorded appearances on the show. Then executive producer Steve Callahan gave an interview shortly after West's death explaining that the production team was still processing their own grief and hadn't yet had a full internal conversation about how to handle the character's future going forward. Callahan said, quote, "That is something we've only barely started to talk about. In a very real, emotional way, I feel like we're all still kind of going through our own grieving process. We haven't really even had a full conversation about it. He just seems so irreplaceable. I don't know who could fill those shoes." He confirmed that Mayor West would still appear in 5 additional already recorded episodes airing that season. But beyond that, the show's future plans remain genuinely undecided, driven by an authentic reluctance to simply plug in a replacement actor and move on as if nothing had happened. That uncertainty stretched on for nearly 2 years. It wasn't until May 12, 2019, nearly 2 full years after West's actual death, that Family Guy finally addressed Mayor West's passing directly within the show's own fictional continuity in an episode titled Adam West High, which also served as that season's finale. The way the show revealed this information to its audience was, in typically Family Guy fashion, handled with almost jarring bluntness rather than sentimentality. At the top of the episode, during a family dinner scene, Lois's sister Carol mentions how sad she's been feeling ever since West's death, at which point Stewie looks up from his phone and asks, "Wait, Uncle Adam is dead? Sheesh, how many people has this show killed?" That single line captures the show's entire approach to handling real-world tragedy, acknowledging genuine loss while immediately undercutting the moment with dark, self-aware humor rather than lingering in pure sentiment. The episode's actual plot centers on Brian proposing that Quahog's James Woods Regional High School be renamed Adam West High, both as a tribute to the late mayor and as a pointed jab at actor James Woods, who by that point had become known for increasingly controversial political statements on social media. Once the renaming succeeds and proves popular, Brian feels emboldened enough to run for mayor of Quahog himself, setting off the episode's central conflict with his rival Glenn Quagmire. Showrunner Rich Appel explained to Entertainment Weekly at the time that the episode was deliberately bookended by tributes to West, saying, quote, "Mayor West makes an appearance at the end of the episode, so the whole episode is bookended by our tribute to him, and there's a sense certainly in the episode that he's not replaceable." As part of that tribute, the episode included a special video dedication set to Richard Marx's ballad, Right Here Waiting, reminding viewers of specific memorable Mayor West moments from across the show's run. The episode closed with genuine, previously recorded, live-action footage of Adam West himself, footage that had originally been produced for a mobile game called Family Guy, The Quest for Stuff, showing the real actor encouraging people to vote for him to be mayor of their own hometowns. It's an unusual choice, ending an animated sitcom's tribute episode with actual footage of the real person rather than purely animated content, but it gave viewers one last direct glimpse of the genuine human being behind nearly 2 decades of comedic mayoral chaos. Family Guy's decision to never recast Adam West's exact character, choosing instead to introduce an entirely new mayor with a different name, different voice actor, and different comedic energy, reflects a level of care that's genuinely uncommon for a show this consistently irreverent and willing to joke about almost anything. It stands in direct contrast to how the show would go on to handle the loss of another beloved cast member, a story that involves its own emotional eulogy sequence, and which we're going to get into next, alongside the writer's strike that pulled MacFarlane himself away from the show entirely, and the remarkable, borderline miraculous chain of events involving DVD sales and late-night cable reruns that saved this entire series from permanent cancellation in the first place. Family Guy's handling of Adam West's death set a template of sorts for honoring a real performer's passing, but it wasn't the only time the show had to figure out how to say goodbye to someone whose voice had become permanently woven into a character. The other major example involves an actress whose real-life passing hit especially hard given her own iconic status, and whose Family Guy tribute leaned even more directly into acknowledging the actress herself rather than just her character. Carrie Fisher voiced Angela, Peter Griffin's boss at the Pawtucket Brewery, appearing in the role across roughly 25 episodes starting in 2005. If you know Fisher primarily from her most famous role as Princess Leia in the Star Wars franchise, her Family Guy character couldn't have been more different in tone. Angela was gruff, no-nonsense, and constantly exasperated by Peter's incompetence as a brewery employee, a far cry from anything resembling Fisher's most iconic on-screen persona. Fisher passed away on December 27, 2016, at the age of 60, following sudden cardiac arrest. Family Guy's initial response came quickly, with an opening title card dedicated to Fisher appearing in January 2017, just weeks after her death, a relatively fast acknowledgement compared to the 2-year gap that would follow Adam West's passing later that same year. But the more substantial tribute came nearly 2 years later, in a December 2018 episode that finally addressed Angela's death directly within the show's story. The episode opens with Peter delivering a eulogy at Angela's funeral, and the writing threads a careful needle between honoring the character and honoring the real actress behind her. Peter's eulogy includes the line, quote, "She had grace, courage, and an unmatched zest for life. She may be gone, but her voice will live on in DVD and Hulu Plus and tiny droid-projected messages. I may have lost a boss, but heaven has gained a princess." That reference to droid-projected messages is a fairly direct nod to Fisher's role as Princess Leia, specifically evoking the classic Star Wars scene where Leia's message is projected by R2-D2, blending the animated character's send-off with an unmistakable tribute to the real woman who voiced her. The episode's cause of death for Angela was revealed with typical Family Guy dark comedic timing, explained as, quote, "swimming less than 20 minutes after she had eaten," a joke that undercuts the emotional weight of the moment immediately after landing it, which is very much in keeping with how this show tends to process real grief. Family Guy showrunner Rich Appel shared a personal memory of working with Fisher in an interview around this same period, recalling a moment during a recording session that captures something genuine about who she was as a person. He described watching Fisher, while waiting to record her lines, pick up a recording of her own name and personal history, coming upon a spread of photos featuring her parents, Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher, alongside pictures of herself as a little girl. According to Appel, Fisher spent the next 20 minutes reading the material out loud, annotating it as she went, almost performing her own life story like one of her stage shows. When Appel asked if she wanted to keep the material, Fisher reportedly told him, quote, "I don't need it, I lived it." It's a small human anecdote, but it says something meaningful about the kind of presence Fisher brought into a recording booth, even for a relatively minor recurring role on an adult animated comedy. Angela's brewery position was subsequently filled by 2 new characters, a married couple named Bert and Sheila, voiced respectively by Bryan Cranston and Niecy Nash, giving the show an opportunity to bring in 2 more recognizable names into its already sprawling roster of guest and recurring voices. Now let's talk about a moment when the entire production of Family Guy came to a stop, not because of a death or a cast departure, but because of a labor dispute that pulled Seth MacFarlane away from his own creation entirely, twice, roughly 15 years apart. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike was one of the most significant labor actions in the history of American television, lasting 100 days and disrupting production across dozens of shows nationwide. MacFarlane, as a WGA member himself and the creator of Family Guy, made the decision to fully join the strike, ceasing all involvement with the show for the duration of the dispute. According to accounts from that period, MacFarlane specifically identified the episode Lois Kills Stewie as the last fully produced installment he would be involved with until the strike was resolved. 2 subsequent episodes, Padre de Familia and Peter's Daughter, ended up airing anyway because Fox decided to complete the finishing touches on material that had already been substantially produced before the strike began, allowing them to air as scheduled during November 2007 sweeps. Another episode, McStroke, was also fully completed before the strike's eventual resolution. Once the WGA and the studios reached an agreement, production resumed without any long-term disruption to the show's overall trajectory. What makes this detail genuinely interesting is that MacFarlane repeated almost the exact same action 15 years later during the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike. On May 2, 2023, after negotiations between the WGA and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers broke down, an estimated 11,500 writers walked out. MacFarlane, along with Family Guy showrunners Brian Boyle, Matt Weitzman, Rich Apple, and Alex Sulkin, informed 20th Television that none of them would return to work on either Family Guy or American Dad until the strike concluded. MacFarlane was photographed on the picket lines in visible support of the walkout. Deadline reported at the time that MacFarlane's production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, hadn't even received a formal suspension letter from its parent company, since MacFarlane had already completed his obligations for that particular season of Family Guy by the time the strike began, with the show's 21st season having already concluded its 20-episode run on May 7th of that same year. The practical impact on Family Guy's release schedule ended up being fairly minimal, specifically because MacFarlane's involvement in that season had already wrapped, but the symbolic weight of the show's own creator walking picket lines in solidarity with writers, having done the exact same thing during a nearly identical dispute a decade and a half earlier, reinforced just how consistently MacFarlane has positioned himself as an advocate for writers' labor rights throughout his entire career, regardless of how successful or established his own position within the industry had become. Now, back to that earlier thread we left hanging, the story of how Family Guy actually survived its own cancellation, because this is genuinely one of the more unlikely resurrection stories in modern television history, and it directly shapes the eventual fortunes of every single voice actor we've talked about so far in this video. We already covered how Fox canceled Family Guy after its third season in 2002, with one final unaired episode not making it to air until it appeared on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim programming block over a year later, in November 2003. What we haven't fully explored yet is exactly how dramatic and unexpected the show's recovery actually was. Once Family Guy started airing in reruns on Adult Swim in April 2003, it almost immediately became the highest-rated program on the entire late-night block, dominating its time slot against both cable and broadcast competition, and boosting the network's overall viewership in that time period by an astonishing 239%, according to figures reported by USA Today at the time. Cartoon Network had reportedly acquired the rerun rights to the show basically for free, according to the president of 20th Century Fox Television, since virtually no other network showed any interest in picking up a canceled animated sitcom that Fox itself had given up on twice. At the exact same moment those Adult Swim reruns were exploding in popularity, DVD sales for the show's already completed seasons were performing at a level nobody in the industry anticipated. The complete first and second seasons, released together on DVD the same week the show premiered on Adult Swim, sold roughly 2.2 million copies, making the set the second best-selling television DVD of all time at that point, trailing only behind the first season of Comedy Central's Chappelle's Show. This combination, a cult phenomenon exploding simultaneously through late-night cable reruns and unprecedented DVD sales figures, created enough commercial pressure that Fox reversed its own decision and revived Family Guy for a fourth season, which premiered on May 1, 2005, roughly 3 years after the network had originally pulled the plug. The show's own writers clearly understood just how unusual this resurrection was, because they built the joke directly into the first episode airing after the revival. North by North Quahog features Peter explaining to his family that the show had been canceled specifically because Fox needed to make room in its schedule for other programming, at which point he rattles off an absurdly long list of short-lived, mostly forgotten shows that actually did occupy network schedules around that same period, including titles like Dark Angel, Titus, Wonderfalls, Firefly, and nearly 24 others. It's a joke that only works if you understand just how many other shows came and went during Family Guy's 3-year absence, all while the cartoon that had actually been canceled kept building a larger and larger fan base completely outside the traditional broadcast television system that had originally rejected it. This entire saga fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of every single career we've discussed throughout this video. If DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings hadn't created enough commercial pressure to force a revival, Seth MacFarlane's 5 Emmy wins simply don't happen, because most of them came from episodes produced well after the 2005 revival. Alex Borstein's eventual marvelous Mrs. Maisel role, which required her to already be a recognizable enough name for Amy Sherman Palladino to build an entire creative pitch around convincing her she deserved an Emmy, likely doesn't carry the same weight without 2 additional decades of Lois Griffin behind her. Mila Kunis's entire film career, which took off dramatically starting with 2008's Forgetting Sarah Marshall, was built on a foundation of steady, reliable income and industry visibility that came directly from continuing to voice Meg Griffin for years longer than anyone could have predicted back in 2002. Mike Henry never gets the chance to build 20 years with Cleveland Brown, never gets the opportunity to make the specific, deliberate choice to step down from that role in 2020, and Arif Zahir never gets discovered through a YouTube impression of a character that, in an alternate version of history where Family Guy stayed canceled, most people would have simply forgotten within a few years of the show's abrupt 2002 ending. Family Guy's voice cast represents one of the more unusual ensembles in modern American television, precisely because so many of these performers' individual stories intersect directly with broader cultural and industry-wide shifts that had nothing to do with the show itself on the surface. Mike Henry's decision in 2020 became part of a documented, industry-spanning reckoning with which actors should voice which characters, playing out simultaneously across Big Mouth, Central Park, The Simpsons, and Family Guy, all within the same handful of months. Seth Green's Bored Ape saga became a genuine case study cited by entertainment attorneys grappling with entirely new questions about intellectual property ownership in the still unsettled world of blockchain-based digital assets. Mila Kunis's age at the time of her casting connects directly to broader, ongoing conversations about how young actors have historically been cast and managed within the entertainment industry. And the show's own survival, driven entirely by DVD sales and cable reruns rather than traditional network ratings, became a widely cited example in discussions about how physical media and secondary distribution channels reshaped which television shows got a second chance at life during that specific transitional period in the industry. What ties all of these individual threads together, from a security guard's overheard voice becoming Peter Griffin, to a 15-year-old lying about her age to land a role that would define the next quarter century of her career, to a YouTube impressionist turning years of unpaid passion into an actual professional casting, is that every single one of these performers arrived at Family Guy through some combination of accident, persistence, and circumstance that nobody could have fully planned or predicted in advance. Seth MacFarlane built an entire creative universe out of the specific, sometimes tiny details of his own life. A college friendship, an overheard stranger, a favorite film performance, and then spent the better part of 3 decades filling that universe with actors who each brought their own equally specific, equally unplanned histories into the recording booth alongside him. 25 years later, the show is still airing. The original cast, with a small handful of deliberate and carefully considered exceptions, is still largely intact, and the voices that give Quahog its personality remain, even now, one of the most enduring and improbable success stories in the history of American animated television. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with us, and if you enjoyed learning the real stories behind the voices of Family Guy, make sure to subscribe to Movie Fanatic for more deep dives like this one.